And today we're diving into a fascinating man. But as always, I'm joined by my dear friend Christos. Christos, do you know anything about Hannibal?
Hannibal
All right.
Lecter.
Nope, not Hannibal. See, Christos, this is why people comment all the time that they're pissed off with you derailing every episode. All right, today we are talking about Hannibal. I'm sure you've heard of this guy. You're like, oh, Hannibal, maybe Hannibal's at the gates. Maybe that's something you've heard. The guy that crossed the Alps with a bunch of elephants or something. North African. Who really is this guy? Well, today we're doing a deep dive on everything that you need to know. But before we fully understand who Hannibal was and why he was terrorizing Rome, we have to understand the world that he was born into. So Carthage in the 3rd century BC was no ordinary city. It was the crown jewel of the Mediterranean, a maritime empire that was basically built on like centuries of trading and conquest. I mean, if you can imagine it, there's just these massive harbors where ships from every corner of the world were unloading their goods. I mean, Spanish silver, you got gold from Africa, stones and, gems from distant lands. The city's double harbor featured a circular sort of military port that ingeniously hid from view from the ocean. And you could also shelter hundreds of warships. And this was a design that amazed even Roman visitors. Wealthy merchants built these palatial homes adorned with like mosaics and, the city's famous purple dye, which, people talk about. And it was even worth more than gold at the time. And it was just flowing through the markets. And there was dozens of languages, mixing in with the sea breeze and some seagulls. And for nearly 4 centuries, Carthage had been the undisputed commander of the Western Mediterranean. Its colonies dotted the coastlines of Spain and Sicily and Sardinia, and its influence reached from, basically like Hercules all the way to Libya. This was an empire that was not built on conquest alone. Obviously, conquest is a part of it, but on the patient accumulation of wealth and a lot of, smart exploitation of, maritime superiority. But by 247 BC, cracks were starting to show in this facade, and a new power was rising in the north, and that place is Rome. And oh boy, Rome in this time is hungry. So, in the great trading city of Carthage in the North African coast, you can see it on the map here, there was a boy who was born who would one day terrorize an empire, Hannibal Barca. And Hannibal, entered into this, world already shaped by his father's ambitions and his, homeland's rivalry with the Roman people. So his father, Hamilcar Barca, was not just a normal guy. He was this distinguished general who fought fiercely in the First Punic War. This was a brutal conflict that ended with Carthage's defeat and the loss of Sicily to Rome. So Hamilcar, his dad, was this guy had a grudge, needless to say. And he was waiting for his moment to strike back. And the defeat had shattered more than the Carthaginian pride. So the peace terms were devastating for the people of Carthage. So massive, basically like austerity measures or like indemnities that were put on the treasury, the loss of Sicily's grain revenues, and worst of all, the surrender of that naval supremacy that actually made Carthage the empire that it was. So this once mighty Carthaginian fleet was now just kind of a shell of what it was before. Trade routes that had been protected for centuries are now open to this Roman interference. And as you can imagine, for the Carthaginians, this is a problem. So young Hannibal grew up just living in this resentment. And he would walk through, his city that kind of just held on to the scars of the defeat in this battle. And the grand merchant houses, still stood, but many families had been ruined by this war. And, that harbor that I was talking about that was once, bustling with these warships now was, a little bit quieter than normal. And every day he witnessed the consequences of this defeat in the Punic Wars. Then, when Rome opportunistically seized Sardinia and demanded even more tribute money, it was like pouring salt on this wound. So Rome's greed was planting the seeds of its own retribution. And then came the moment that would change the course of history. Hannibal was still a child when his father prepared to leave for Spain to basically rebuild Carthage's former glory. The boy, desperate to not be left behind, begged to come along. So Hannibal's dad, Hamilcar, led his son to the altar where they were making sacrifices to the gods. In front of these sacred ritual flames with the blood of the sacrificed sheep still warm, he made the boy place his hand onto this sacrificed sheep, and he swore an oath never to be the friend of the Romans. Now think about that. a young boy swearing this eternal hatred against an empire and just an entire people. And this wasn't just political, it was like a sacred vow that was sworn before the gods themselves. And from that very day, every choice that Hannibal made, every battle, every decision would basically be to destroy Rome. He wanted to be Pilate. That's the best way to put it. He wanted to be Pilate. He wanted to destroy Rome with everything, all from this oath from childhood. So now in Spain, under his father's watchful eye, Hannibal was starting to learn the brutal art of commanding a military and military strategy and just survival in general. Here, among the Iberian tribes and the veteran soldiers, Hannibal began to display the qualities that would make him legendary. Even as a teenager, Hannibal showed this amazing ability to connect with the men in, the tribes or even just the soldiers that he was now commanding as, a young man. He was noted for sharing their hardships and listening to their stories, remembering names. Ancient sources suggest that he could communicate with a wide range of soldiers, though the exact languages he spoke are not really specified. Around the campfires, he would sit with, the common man, even the low-ranking soldiers, and would share their rations and their experiences. And this wasn't calculated political theater. It was genuine. Hannibal understood that an army's strength wasn't from the weapons or from the strategy. It was from the hearts of the men who wielded them. So veterans who had served under both father and son would later say that Hamilcar commanded respect, but Hannibal inspired devotion. So when his father Hamilcar died in 229 BC, leadership passed to Hannibal's brother-in-law, Hasdrubal the Fair. Under Hasdrubal, the young Hannibal's reputation continued to grow. Even these Spanish, war chiefs began to recognize something extraordinary was happening with young Hannibal. But in 221 BC, when Hasdrubal was assassinated, something happened. Carthaginian soldiers in Spain didn't wait for orders from home. They unanimously elected the 26-year-old Hannibal to be their commander. I mean, these are like hardened veterans, men who had seen death and glory and fought in wars. They chose to follow a young man, barely, out of his 20s. And it spoke to the charisma and the brilliance that Hannibal had already been displaying. So Hannibal abandoned his, predecessor's diplomatic approach and returned to his father's aggressive military policies. And oh boy, Hannibal was fired up.